Tonight, our guest is John Bolton, former White House NSC chief under the previous presidency of Donald Trump. And right now, if we want to know more about John, I have the TV profile with Elaine Corby.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. I'm trying to tell you everything about John Bolton. So he is the man who provoked the scandal just before the 2020 US presidential election. In an explosive book, John Bolton made his confidences on President Donald Trump after 17 months as his national security advisor. He described a highly acidic portrait of Trump, cementing his reputation as a free electron. So who is John Bolton? Well, he was born in 1948 from a modest family in the suburbs of Baltimore. His mother was a housewife and his father a former GI wounded in the Normandy landings. As for John, he studied law and became a lawyer, and early on he adopted an anti-communist stance and campaigned for the war in Vietnam. He had several jobs linked with the international relations, first with Ronald Reagan, then George Bush, and later on with George W. Bush. Throughout his career, he held positions opposed to peacekeeping operations, but in favor of preemptive wars, sometimes flirting with the far right. John Bolton is a true nationalist Republican.
Thank you, Ellen. Welcome back, John. First, I would like to know what you expect from a new Trump administration after 4 years of Biden's presidency.
Well, I think the first thing that Trump is interested in is retribution. He wants to go after his former enemies, possibly by prosecuting them, possibly by taking other action. That's very much on his mind. I think he wants to institute a number of policies that are going to be quite controversial, expelling all illegal migrants in the United States, which I think you can expect to see start right on January the 20th, Inauguration Day. And then very shortly after that, launching basically a trade war against almost everybody in the world. He said he would put tariffs at 10 to 20% on all imports, 60% against China. Just recently, he's announced 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada. So quite apart from international politics, on the economic side of things, I think it's going to be a very, very different approach, very different from any other Republican presidential nominee in the last half century.
For you, John, is Donald Trump fit for the job when he has to face the Iranian and Ukrainian challenges?
I don't think Trump is fit to be president. I said that in my book. I don't think he understands what's at stake in international affairs. He doesn't know very much. I know this is difficult for many to understand, especially in France. He has no philosophy. He has no philosophy. He doesn't do policy as we understand it. He is transactional, episodic. He sees things through the prism of what benefits Donald Trump and doesn't follow a consistent line that you can see and understand.
Will he be able to get rid of the Iranian regime and its nuclear program, which are a real existential threat to Israel?
Well, he said when he was president the first time, and he has said in the campaign that regime change in Iran is not his objective. He talks about returning to the maximum pressure campaign of economic sanctions. The trouble with that, though, as long as the regime in Tehran is in place, it will be an existential threat to Israel, and its nuclear proliferation and support for terrorism make it a threat to the United States, to the Gulf Arab countries, to Europe, really the world as a whole. So a lot could happen between now and January the 20th. We'll see what Bibi Netanyahu does. But Trump, I think, is always open to negotiating with Iran. I lay out in my book how Emmanuel Macron brought in the Iranian foreign minister Javad Zarif to the Biarritz G7 summit and tried to get Trump to meet with him, which would have been a disaster. He didn't do it, but he was very, very close.
According to you, John, can he negotiate with Iran, as you mentioned it, which wants, we have to remember that, the destruction of Israel and which DNA is terrorism?
Right. Look, Trump will negotiate with anyone. That's why the fact he didn't meet with Javad Zarif in August of 2019 is remarkable. I was with him with Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and Mick Mulvaney, the White House chief of staff. Mulvaney and I opposed him meeting with Zarif. Jared thought he should. It was that close. For Trump, the temptation to make the deal of the century is very hard to resist. That's why he negotiated with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. He thinks that deals are discrete events. It's not that he's pursuing a policy. He just thinks he can make a deal, and if he does, it will get him a lot of attention. So I think those who believe that Trump will be reflexively pro-Israel and anti-Iran are misreading the man himself.
John, question of the moment. What about these supposed to be ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah? Is it serious? Is it reliable?
Well, there's a lot of talk in the air. Of course, there's been talk in the air over the past year plus there'd be this ceasefire in Gaza and that ceasefire in Gaza, and earlier talk of ceasefires in Lebanon. The Biden administration is putting enormous pressure on Netanyahu and the Israelis. I think it would be a mistake for Israel to enter into a ceasefire. I think they're dismembering Hezbollah and Hamas. They need to continue to do that for their own security and for the rest of the world. And interestingly, the period of the ceasefire that the Biden administration is talking about that may be attractive to Netanyahu is that it would last for 60 days. Well, as of now, that would take the Biden administration to the end of its term. So what Biden is really doing here, I think, is politically motivated. He wants to restrain Netanyahu for the remainder of his term. And Bibi may say, okay, I don't like it, but I'll do it because when I get to Trump's term, I may have more leeway.
I have one question now from Elaine Corby to you, John, especially on this unexpected reaction from the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Helen?
Yes, Christian, because the past week the ICC issued warrant arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. They are charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. According to the Israeli Prime Minister, this decision is a black day in the history of nations and a moral bankruptcy. Let's hear what he had to say.
This is an anti-Semitic measure that has on one goal, to deter us from exercising our natural right to defend ourselves against our enemies who rise up against us to destroy us.
John Bolton, what judgments do you bear on this accusation?
Well, I've written now for 25 years that the International Criminal Court is fundamentally illegitimate. It's not a real court, it's a pretend court. My proudest moment of all my years of government service was in the George W. Bush administration when I unsigned the Statute of Rome that created the court. So the U.S. will never, if I have anything to say about it, never become a party. It's a fantasy idea that this court should have jurisdiction over a country and an official that never signed, never ratified the treaty. It's a radical assault on national sovereignty, even for EU members that are busy giving their sovereignty up to Brussels. This is a usurpation they never should have agreed to. I'm glad that the Israelis are defying the arrest warrants. I congratulate them, and we should support the Israeli government fully and simply disregarding whatever the ICC does.
John, Donald Trump said he is ready to resume talks with Vladimir Putin. What are your expectations, and under what conditions can they end the war in Ukraine?
I'm very worried about the future of Ukraine. I think basically what Trump wants is he wants this war off the table before he takes office on January the 20th. I'd say the same about the war in the Middle East. He thinks they're Biden's wars. He just doesn't want to deal with them. But what that shows is he doesn't care how these wars end. They won't end by January the 20th. He will have to deal with them, but he just wants them over with. That's bad news for Ukraine. Trump said in the campaign he would get Zelensky and Putin in a room together and he'd solve it in 24 hours. That isn't going to happen, but it won't be Trump's fault because it's never Trump's fault. Therefore, it must be somebody else's fault, and I'm worried that Trump's relationship with Putin will lead him quickly to the conclusion it's Zelensky's fault, and that will be bad news for Ukraine.
When Vladimir Putin declares he will use the nuclear arm against the West? Should the West use ballistic hypersonic missiles against Russia? And do you take his purposes for granted? And finally, the question, John, is there a risk of Third World War?
Well, look, any time Putin makes a threat, whether it's nuclear or conventional, I think we should evaluate it, take it seriously for that purpose. But the history for nearly 3 years now in Ukraine is that Putin has been bluffing every time. But he's nonetheless intimidated Biden and NATO by the fear of what they call over and over again a wider war. If Putin has an army hidden somewhere to make a conventional threat, where is it? And by the way, why isn't it in Ukraine now to make up for the pitiful performance of Russian troops already there? On the nuclear front, we have public testimony by U.S. intelligence community officials that there has never been evidence after a Putin nuclear threat that they've deployed their rocket forces, their nuclear capabilities in any way to indicate they were getting ready to use them. So it's been bluff from start to finish. And if you simply acquiesce in Putin's bluff, you give him what he wants for free. No wonder the Ukraine has not been able to make significant progress on the battlefield with that kind of attitude on our part.
John, will Donald Trump, according to you, be able to face the growing and threatening axis, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea?
Well, I think that axis is in formation. It's not perfect. There's still internal problems. There's still problems with some of the satellite nations, if we can call them that. But there's no doubt that this is the dominant threat to the West in the 21st century. I'm not sure Trump is able to understand that fully, and I think he's vulnerable to Putin or Xi Jinping coming to him to say, look, we've got differences between our countries, but the two of us, the three of us, we can work all these out. Let's just sit down and do that. Xi Jinping could say, let's make the deal of the century on trade and get past all of these disputes. I think Trump could be induced to do that. So while the threat is very real, I just don't think it registers on Trump, and I don't think we know the answer yet if he's prepared to expand the American defense budget adequately to deal with these threats. But it's something the U.S. needs to do while at the same time bringing the budget deficit down so we can reduce the national debt. It's a tall order. Whether Trump's up to it, I don't know. And it's complicated by this threat of imposing significant tariffs on imports to America and the risk of a trade war, which could affect all of our economies.
I know that Donald Trump doesn't trust European Union and NATO, but can they be united to fight this evil axis I was just mentioning?
Well, I think that on the trade issue, to begin with that, if the U.S. joined with Great Britain, European Union, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and others, we could exert enormous economic pressure on China. Not for trade reasons, but for national security reasons, to stop the Chinese from stealing our intellectual property, among other things, and threatening smaller nations along their Indo-Pacific periphery. That was suggested to Trump in the first term, and he wouldn't go along with it. He likes fighting with his friends more than he likes fighting with his adversaries. I think that this threat of China in the military sphere, though, could manifest itself very quickly with the threat of a blockade around Taiwan, which could suffocate the island unless we were prepared to break the blockade. A lot of questions there. I'm just not sure Trump really understands enough about this problem to be effective against the China-Russia axis.
I know, John, that Donald Trump doesn't trust European Union, as I said, but he doesn't like Emmanuel Macron, whom he considers as a flip-flopper. Is it a problem for the U.S.-European Union relationship?
Well, mostly he doesn't like Macron, but sometimes he does. As I said, at Biarritz in 2019, Macron almost talked him into meeting with Javad Zarif. I think what Trump really doesn't like is the European Union, who he thinks has disadvantaged the United States on trade deals. And by the way, with a few exceptions, France being among them, haven't really met their commitments at Cardiff, Wales in 2014 to spend 2% on GDP on defense. More or close to it, but if my analysis is correct, the United States is going to have to go from 3% of GDP on defense back to Reagan-era levels, 5%, maybe 6%, which means other NATO members are going to have to go from 2 to 4%.
When you say he doesn't like the European Union, is it because he considers the European Union as too much anti-Israeli?
Well, I think he doesn't. I think it's focused mostly on trade issues and on the failure to meet NATO obligations. There are a lot of other reasons to be worried about the European Union, which is why the United Kingdom withdrew from the EU. But that's not, I think, what Trump is worried about. It'll be an issue dealing with China, though, given the dependence of many important European economies on the Chinese market, Germany especially, but France, the two largest. It's going to be difficult, I think, to reduce reliance on purchases from and sales into China. U.S. imports from China, by the way, have declined precipitously in the past 3 or 4 years, and China has gone from being our #1 trading partner to our #3 trading partner in that period.
According to you, John, will Donald Trump be tough enough to restore the credibility of the West Bloc?
Well, his problems with NATO may preclude that, and I'm in a context drawing out of Ukraine. I'm very worried about what he'll do to NATO. He has really never fully concealed his desire to withdraw from NATO. He looks at it this way: he thinks we defend Europe, we don't get anything out of it, and Europe won't pay for it. So what's the point? He doesn't understand collective defense alliances. He doesn't understand that the U.S. Benefits from having allies in Europe, and it's been explained to him, and it's never taken. So I'm very worried about what he's going to do with respect to NATO.
The world governance under U.S. domination is obsolete. Will, according to you, John, will Donald Trump try to regain its leadership?
Well, global governance has a number of different meanings. Some people look at the United Nations and international organizations. I don't think that's going to work. I think what we've had since 1945 is just an ad hoc array of protections that have kept international trade alive. I think it largely rests on the military power of the United States and its allies. And if Trump moves in an isolationist direction, then I think vacuums could be created all around the world, which our adversaries like China and Iran and North Korea and Russia will try and fill. So I'm worried about what little order we have in the world becoming much less pronounced than it has been with Trump as president. We'll just have to see.
Taking into account the ongoing development of the world situation, what are your expectations, John? If you can foresee, foresee the future, what would it be?
Well, hopefully Trump won't do too much damage during his time in office. And I think if you look over the long term, with China's economic prospects declining, its demographic situation worsening, its population declining, that by the end of the century, the Chinese threat will actually be considerably diminished. Our period of risk is in the next 20 years from China and Russia and their axis. So it really, what it should evoke is a strong Western response through NATO with our allies in the Pacific to stand against this axis. And I think there's every reason to believe we could be successful if we don't walk away from the game and leave the field to our adversaries.
I was asking you previously, John, if you foresee a third world war with all these debates, these things going on with Russia, Iran, and all that. But don't you think we are more likely to have a conflict, or maybe a straightforward conflict, between Iran, the U.S., and Israel?
Well, I think if it moves in that direction, the best thing that could happen, and could happen in the next few months before January the 20th, would be to have Israel destroy Iran's nuclear weapons program, which it could do. It's now destroyed the most important parts of Iran's air defenses. The nuclear program is quite vulnerable, and I think that I think it could be destroyed. On the bigger question, though, this depends, I think, on whether the United States has the resolve to maintain a strong position all around the world, in the nuclear field in particular, because once you have a clear U.S. advantage in nuclear weapons and other weapons, I think that deters adversaries from attacking. And, Donald Rumsfeld used to say, it's American strength has never been provocative. What's provocative is American weakness. And if Trump turns in an isolationist direction, I think China and Russia will take advantage of it.
I know, John, you have been spending 17 months during the past with Donald Trump as an NSC chief. If you had him in front of you today, with all what's going on around us, what would you tell him? What advice would you tell him?
Well, that really is a hypothetical scenario because I don't expect it to happen. But I would tell him the most important thing, the most important thing he needs to do is get a dramatic increase in the U.S. defense budget. Really, across the board, the spectrum of threats that we and our allies face, whether it's in cyberspace, outer space, in the air, on land and sea, in the nuclear field, it's enormous. And while we spend a lot of money already, and in fairness, that could be spent much more efficiently, I just think we've allowed ourselves to fall prey to this idea that we had reached the end of history in the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed. The fact is the threats are still out there, and not just from China and Russia, from nuclear proliferation, from international terrorism. We need a big increase in the defense budget. We need our allies to increase it, and we need to work together against these threats.
For its own sake, John, what would you tell Donald Trump? Would he have to become again, it was an expression used by Ronald Reagan, the gendarme of the world?
Well, I don't think we have to be the world's policeman. I think that's beyond any country's capability. But a strong West acts as a deterrent to those who might be tempted, because if they know that if they commit aggression against, as Russia has committed against Ukraine, that they would suffer far more than any gains they could possibly hope to achieve, they will not make the attempt in the first place. And what we see in the disorder that's spreading in Central Europe, in the Middle East, potentially in Asia, is the feeling that our enemies can get away with aggression. And once they believe that to be the case, the aggression will follow.
Finally, John, I would like to ask you this question. What would be your message to the Western world in this period of big uncertainties?
Well, I think it's important to try and persuade Trump to do the right thing, as to say along the lines I've been recommending in this program, but also to have patience, because it's going to be very hard to get Trump to think systematically. And I would just recall the words of Winston Churchill, who once said, "You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing, usually after they've tried everything else." And Donald Trump is the everything else, and we're going to have to go through it for 4 years. But ultimately, we still have the capacity to prevail over our enemies. We just have to last out this period of tension.
I would like to add, if you allow me to have this addendum, what message would you like to send to the people of Israel, which are fighting very hard for their own existence, facing Iran, which is a barbaric regime, facing its proxies? How would you see? It's very important because we have a lot of TV viewers in this part of the world. What do you tell them? What kind of future can they expect?
Well, they're locked in an enormous struggle right now. I know there's a lot of fatigue with the war in Israel. All I can say is don't give up now. You're winning. You're destroying Hamas and Hezbollah. If Netanyahu destroys the Iranian nuclear weapons program, I think the regime itself could falter. And certainly on behalf of the United States, the support for Israel in the United States remains overwhelming. And we understand the challenges that Israel faces, and I think really most people in the West do understand that. So You're near success against Iran at the moment, not all the way there, but don't give up with the finish line in sight. Finish Hamas, finish Hezbollah, and finish the Iranian nuclear program.
How do you expect, this will be my final question, John, what do you expect from the people who are really defending the existence of Israel, facing these pro-Palestinian fighters who don't want to ignore the existence of Israel? Is that possible? We can accept that.
Well, it's always discouraging when you see the resurgence of anti-Semitism around the world. It's certainly true on American university campuses and even among some members of Congress. We've seen it all across Europe. But just because that news is discouraging doesn't mean that the people of Israel should think that they've been abandoned by the West. That's not true. It's another problem, another obstacle in their way. But I think we're all going to work hard to overcome it. And I think that the leadership in Israel understands that, and the people need to stand with the leadership and prevail in the fight they're in now.
John, I want to thank you very much for having shared our precious time with us today, and feel welcome to come back again to Malard at Large anytime you want. Good evening.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed
Thank you,
it.
John.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you to Hélène Corby too, and Alain Sop.